Priest opens offering box and discovers something terrifying unbelievable. The morning light streamed through the stained glass windows of St. Francis Church, casting an eerie glow on the ancient offering box. Father Matthew's hands trembled as he lifted its heavy lid. Among the scattered bills and coins lay something that made his blood run cold, a small wax figure with piercing glass eyes, its face frozen in an unsettling grimace. As he reached to touch it, a bitter winter wind howled through the chapel, extinguishing every candle. The crucifix crashed to the floor, Christ's face now turned away, as if unable to witness what was about to unfold. Hey friends, before we dive into this chilling church mystery, take a moment to let us know where you're watching from and hit that like button. Your support means everything to our channel. St. Francis Church stood like a weathered guardian at the heart of Millbrook, a small town where winter seemed to linger longer each year. Its stone walls, blackened by decades of harsh winters, housed more stories of loss and redemption than any other building in town, but none quite like Father Matthew Reynolds' own tale. At 32, Father Matthew was unusually young to lead such a historic parish. His dark hair had already begun graying at the temples, each silver strand marking another soul he'd tried to save in this struggling community. His eyes, deep brown and gentle, carried the weight of someone who had seen both the darkest and most beautiful sides of humanity. 25 years ago, on a night much like this one, a 5-year-old Matthew had been found huddled against these very church steps, his parents' fate forever remaining a mystery. The previous priest, Father Daniel, had taken him in without question. God sends his children home in mysterious ways, he'd always said. The church's wooden floors still creaked in the same places they had when young Matthew would sneak down at night, finding solace among the saint statues that seemed to watch over him. Now, as head of the parish, he had transformed St. Francis into more than just a place of worship. In a town ravaged by factory closures and growing poverty, the church had become a sanctuary for the forgotten. The basement, once used only for storage, now served as a soup kitchen and shelter. Every night, its worn tables hosted dozens of homeless individuals seeking warmth from the brutal Michigan winter. The offering box, standing solemnly near the altar, had become crucial to sustaining these efforts, though donations had grown scarcer as the town's economy continued to decline. Father Matthew's office, tucked behind the sacristy, remained largely unchanged from Father Daniel's time. The same worn Bible sat open on the desk, its pages marked with decades of annotations. The only addition was a small, framed photograph of Father Daniel with a young Matthew at his first communion, a reminder of the path that had led him here. But lately something had changed within these hallowed walls. The warmth that had always permeated the church, even in the coldest winters, had begun to fade. The candles seemed to burn dimmer, the shadows longer, and the silence heavier. Father Matthew had noticed it first in the way the morning light no longer reached certain corners of the nave, as if something was gradually consuming the church's inner light. Even the most faithful parishioners had begun to whisper about strange occurrences, hymn books found rearranged overnight, unexplained cold spots near the confessional, and the persistent smell of melting wax where no candles burned. Yet Father Matthew kept these concerns to himself, remembering Father Daniel's words, "Faith is tested not in light but in darkness." Little did he know that the discovery in the offering box would test not just his faith, but the very foundations upon which he had built his life's purpose. Among the faces that filled St. Francis each morning, two stood out with particular significance. Peter Anderson, a 17-year-old altar boy with earnest blue eyes and sandy hair, shared a past that echoed Father Matthew's own. Found abandoned at a local hospital 3 years ago, Peter had found refuge at St. Francis, his quiet dedication to the church masking years of unspoken pain. Mrs. Helen Crawford, the church treasurer for over 2 decades, carried herself with the rigid posture of someone perpetually bearing an invisible burden. Her gray hair was always pulled back in a tight bun, her clothes modest but impeccable despite their age. At 65, she had outlived both her husband and her only daughter, channeling her grief into meticulous care of the church's finances and affairs. The dynamics of Millbrook's remaining faithful reflected the town's growing divisions. The morning mass drew the old guard, retired factory workers, elderly widows, and a handful of local business owners who still remembered the town's prosperous days. They sat in their assigned pews, clutching well-worn prayer books, their faces etched with concern over the changing times. The evening services, by contrast, attracted a different crowd. The homeless seeking shelter, addicts fighting for recovery, and struggling single mothers formed a congregation that some traditional members whispered about with barely concealed disapproval. Yet Father Matthew saw in their desperate prayers a faith more raw and real than any polished Sunday sermon. Between these worlds moved the enigmatic figure of Helen Crawford. She kept the church books with mathematical precision, but her stern exterior softened noticeably around Peter. On cold mornings, she would silently leave a warm coffee on his cleaning cart, her eyes lingering on him with an emotion that seemed deeper than mere charity. The church council meetings had grown tenser in recent months. Declining donations and increasing needs strained both resources and relationships. Some council members questioned the wisdom of maintaining the shelter, while others pushed for more community outreach. Helen sat silently through these debates, her pen scratching figures in her ledger, speaking only when asked direct questions about the finances. Peter watched these dynamics unfold from the shadows of the sacristy, his sensitive nature picking up undercurrents that others missed. He noticed how Helen's hands trembled when counting the offering, how certain council members avoided meeting Father Matthew's eyes when discussing the shelter's future, and how the atmosphere in the church grew heavier with each passing week. Yet none of them, not Peter with his quiet observations, nor Helen with her precise records, nor even Father Matthew with his unwavering faith, could have predicted how their carefully maintained world would soon unravel. As winter's grip tightened around Millbrook, forces both earthly and otherworldly were converging on St. Francis, threatening to expose long-buried secrets and test the bounds of faith, love, and redemption. The morning after Millbrook's harshest snowstorm in decades, Father Matthew discovered that thousands of dollars meant for the homeless shelter had vanished from the offering box. The timing couldn't have been worse. The shelter was already overcrowded, with temperatures plummeting well below zero. $3,427, Helen announced, her voice unusually tight as she rechecked her ledger. Just gone. The morning light cast harsh shadows across her face, aging her by years. And this, she gestured to the wax figure that sat ominously on Father Matthew's desk. The figure was unlike anything the priest had ever seen. About 6 inches tall, it bore an uncanny resemblance to a weeping person, its glass eyes containing an almost lifelike gleam. On its chest, carved with precise strokes, was a symbol that made Father Matthew's skin crawl, a circle surrounded by spiraling lines with what appeared to be an inverted cross at its center. I found it buried beneath the remaining bills, Father Matthew explained, watching as Peter examined the figure from a safe distance. The boy's face had gone pale, his hands clutching his rosary beads. "Peter, did you notice anyone unusual near the offering box yesterday?" "No," Father Peter replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "But last night I had a dream." He hesitated, glancing nervously at Helen. "I saw someone placing something in the box. It was like looking at a shadow." Helen's ledger slammed shut with unexpected force, making both Peter and Father Matthew jump. "Dreams are just dreams," she said sharply. "What matters is the missing money. That was meant for food and blankets. Without it—" She didn't need to finish. They all knew what it meant. The shelter housed 37 people now, including 5 children. The food pantry was already running low, and the ancient heating system struggled against the relentless cold. Father Matthew picked up the wax figure, surprised by its weight. Despite the freezing room, it felt warm to the touch. As he turned it over, something caught his eye, a small marking on the base, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. Numbers, scratched into the wax, 3,427. The exact amount missing. "Helen," he said slowly, "how many people knew the precise amount in the offering box?" The treasurer's face went ashen. "Only 3, Father. You, me," and her eyes drifted to Peter, who took a step back, shaking his head in disbelief. "No," he protested, tears welling in his eyes. "I would never." But the evidence seemed damning. Peter had access to the church at all hours. He knew the security code, had keys to every room, and most importantly, he knew the exact count from helping Helen the previous evening. Outside, the wind howled through the eaves of St. Francis, carrying with it the sound of distant bells. The wax figure in Father Matthew's hands grew warmer still, its glass eyes reflecting the growing shadows in the room. Something had been set in motion, something that would test not just their faith, but the very bonds that held their small community together. Word of the missing funds spread through Millbrook like wildfire on a winter wind. By evening mass, the church pews were filled with whispers and accusing glances. Peter felt their eyes following him as he prepared the altar, each movement scrutinized, each gesture questioned. "It just doesn't look right," Margaret Wheeler, head of the parish council, declared during the emergency meeting. A homeless boy, given free rein of the church, access to everything, her voice carried across the conference room where 24 community leaders had gathered. And now this demonic object appears right when the money vanishes. Father Matthew stood at the head of the table, his collar feeling unusually tight. Peter has been nothing but faithful to this church. These accusations are based on facts, interrupted Richard Thompson, the local bank manager. The boy has a history of instability. Remember the incident at the school last year? The room fell silent. They all remembered Peter's breakdown during the Christmas pageant, screaming about seeing shadows in the nativity scene. It had taken Father Matthew hours to calm him down. That was different. Helen spoke up unexpectedly, her voice sharp as ice. The boy had just learned about his mother's death. Any child would. She stopped abruptly, as if catching herself revealing too much. Standing in the doorway, Peter heard every word. His hands trembled as he clutched his worn prayer book, a gift from Helen on his first day as altar boy. The same book now felt heavy with betrayal. The figure Thompson continued, pulling it from his briefcase. "My wife researches these things. It's used in certain dark practices. To curse holy places." He placed it on the table, and several council members visibly recoiled. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Through the windows, snow began to fall again, thick flakes swirling in the gathering darkness. "I vote we call the police," Margaret declared, "before anything else goes missing." No, Father Matthew's voice cut through the murmurs. "This is a matter for the church to handle. We need prayer, not handcuffs." "Prayer won't feed the homeless," Thompson countered. "That money was meant for real people, Father, real suffering." In the hallway, Peter backed away from the door, tears freezing on his cheeks. The shadows around him seemed to lengthen, reaching out with dark fingers. The wax figure on the table appeared to watch him through the doorway, its glass eyes reflecting candlelight like twin flames. Helen's voice rose again. "If we start turning on our own." "He's not our own," Margaret interrupted. "He's a stranger we took in, perhaps too trustingly." The final words hit Peter like physical blows. Without waiting to hear more, he turned and ran, his footsteps echoing through the empty church. Behind him, the meeting erupted into chaos, but he couldn't hear it over the pounding of his heart and the howling winter wind that seemed to chase him into the gathering storm. The sanctuary he had known for 3 years had become his accusation, and the only mother figure he'd ever known sat silently as his world crumbled around him. The temperature had dropped to 15 below zero as Peter stumbled through Millbrook's deserted streets. The wind cut through his thin jacket. He hadn't stopped to grab his coat from the church closet. His shelter uniform badge, still pinned to his chest, felt like a brand of shame now. Behind him, St. Francis's bells tolled 9 times, each ring fading into the howling storm. He could barely see through the curtain of snow and tears, his feet carrying him automatically toward the only other place he'd ever called home, the abandoned bell tower at St. Mary's, the church that had burned down 3 winters ago. "Peter. Peter, wait." Father Matthew's voice carried through the storm, but Peter ran faster. The priest's footsteps crunched in the snow behind him, growing closer. "Please, son." That word "son" made Peter's chest tighten. He'd heard it hundreds of times before, but tonight it felt like another betrayal. He ducked into an alley, his shoes slipping on the ice. The cold was becoming dangerous. Now his fingers had lost all feeling. "Let me help you," Father Matthew called again, closer now. "You'll freeze out here." Peter emerged on Warren Street, where the old factory's broken windows stared down like blank eyes. A memory flashed. Helen leading him past here on his first day, her hand warm on his shoulder, promising him a home at St. Francis. "God sends his children home in mysterious ways," she'd said, echoing Father Matthew's own story. But he wasn't a child of God to them anymore. He was a thief, a deceiver, a placer of cursed objects. The wind knocked him sideways, sending him sprawling into a snowbank. As he struggled to his feet, his prayer book fell from his pocket, pages fluttering open. A piece of paper slipped out a photograph he'd found in Helen's office weeks ago, one he'd meant to ask her about. And in it, a much younger Helen held a baby, her smile radiant. On the back was written a date and 2 words, "My Peter." He never got to ask her about it. Now he might never know. The photograph disappeared into the storm as another gust knocked him down. This time he couldn't find the strength to stand. The cold had seeped into his bones, and the snow looked almost inviting, like a soft white blanket. Peter Father Matthew's voice seemed distant now, or maybe Peter was the one drifting away. As his eyes grew heavy, the shadows around him seemed to dance. In them he saw the wax figure from the offering box, its glass eyes glowing with an inner light. But there was something else now, a familiar warmth in those eyes, like Helen's gaze when she thought he wasn't looking. "Stay with me, son." Suddenly Father Matthew was there, wrapping his thick wool coat around Peter's shivering form. I've got you. The photograph, Peter mumbled through blue lips. "Helen." "Save your strength," Father Matthew ordered, lifting him with surprising power. "We need to get you warm." But Peter wasn't heading back to St. Francis. Through half-frozen eyelids, he recognized the path to Father Matthew's small house behind the church. The priest was choosing him over propriety, shelter over appearances. "They'll talk," Peter whispered. "Let them," Father Matthew replied firmly. "I was found in a storm too, remember? God doesn't abandon his children to the cold. Not then, not now." As consciousness slipped away, Peter thought he saw Helen standing in the swirling snow, reaching out to him. But that was impossible. Helen was back at the church, sitting silently as they condemned him. Wasn't she? While Father Matthew tended to Peter, Helen stood alone in the church office, her hands trembling as she opened the false bottom of her desk drawer. Inside lay evidence of her greatest shame, letters threatening to demolish St. Francis, bank statements showing suspicious transfers, and photographs that could destroy more than just her reputation. The latest letter had arrived yesterday. Final warning. The development starts in spring. Either take the money and ensure a smooth transition, or watch your precious shelter close down anyway. Your choice, Mrs. Crawford. A knock at the door made her jump. Margaret Wheeler entered, snow melting on her expensive coat. "They found him," Margaret said. "The priest took him to his house instead of calling the police." Her tone dripped with disapproval. Helen's fingers closed around the wax figure she'd retrieved from the conference room. "It's getting late, Margaret. You should head home before the storm worsens." "We need to discuss the money, Helen. The council's waiting for answers." Helen looked up, suddenly feeling every one of her 65 years. "You want answers? Fine. Peter didn't take the money. I did." The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret's face went through a series of expressions: shock, confusion, and finally a sort of vindicated anger. "I knew something wasn't right with the books," Margaret began, reaching for her phone. "I'm calling the police." "Call them," Helen interrupted, her voice steady now. "But first, let me show you exactly who you're really working for." She pulled out the stack of letters and photographs. "Your husband's development company isn't just buying land, is it? They're buying souls." Margaret's hand froze over her phone. "You don't know what you're talking about." $300,000, Helen continued, laying out bank statements. "That's what they offered me to lose the church's historical protection paperwork. When I refused, the threat started. They've been squeezing every business around us, Margaret. The homeless shelter isn't just closing because of poverty, it's being strangled." "Progress requires sacrifice," Margaret whispered, but her conviction wavered. Sacrifice. Helen's laugh was bitter. Like Peter, an innocent boy accused of theft to cover up corruption, or the 37 people who'll freeze to death when we close. The development will create jobs. It will create profits. For your husband, for the mayor, for everyone who's been secretly buying up property around the church. Helen's voice broke. "I took the money from the offering box because they froze our shelter account. I had to buy food, blankets. I placed the figure there myself, hoping to buy time while I gathered evidence." Margaret sank into a chair, her face ashen. "If this gets out—" "It will. Tomorrow I'm taking everything to the state prosecutor." But tonight Helen stood, gathering her papers. Tonight, I need to tell Peter the truth. All of it. What truth? Helen pulled out one final photograph, the same one Peter had found, of her holding a baby. That threatening the church means threatening my son. The son I gave up 16 years ago when my husband's gambling debts left me no choice. The son who found his way back to me only to face exile because of my cowardice. The church bells tolled midnight as Helen walked past a stunned Margaret into the raging storm. In her pocket, the wax figure seemed to pulse with warmth, as if approving of truth finally spoken aloud. She only prayed she wasn't too late to save her son, to save the church, to save her own soul from the weight of secrets too long carried alone. The next morning dawned bitter cold, with St. Francis's stained glass windows frosted over like ancient crypts. Father Matthew sat in his study, surrounded by Helen's evidence, each document adding another layer to a conspiracy that threatened to shake Millbrook to its foundations. Mayor Davidson owned 6 shell companies, Helen explained, pointing to a complex web of transactions she'd mapped out. Peter sat quietly beside her, still pale from his ordeal, but his eyes clear and focused. Each one has been buying properties around the church at below market rates. People are being pressured to sell. Father Matthew studied a particularly troubling letter. Threats to elderly parishioners, mysterious building code violations, even the freezing of our shelter account. He looked up at Helen. How long have you been investigating this? Since they first approached me last spring. Helen's hand found Peter's, squeezing gently. When Peter arrived at the church looking so much like his father, I knew I couldn't let him destroy this place. Not again. Again, Father Matthew leaned forward. 16 years ago, my husband Thomas worked for Davidson Construction. He discovered their pattern buying historic properties, arranging accidents that destroyed them, then developing the land. Helen's voice trembled. When he threatened to expose them, they ruined us. Gambling debts appeared from nowhere. Our accounts were drained. Then Thomas, she couldn't continue. Peter completed the sentence. They made it look like suicide. The silence that followed was broken only by the howling wind outside. Father Matthew remembered Thomas Crawford's funeral, how Helen had stood alone, cradling a baby, refusing all comfort. The baby in the photograph, Father Matthew said slowly. That was you, Peter. I gave him up for adoption a month later, Helen whispered, to protect him, but they never stopped watching me. When Peter showed up at St. Francis 3 years ago, I thought God was giving me a second chance, but I was too afraid to tell him the truth. A knock at the study door made them all jump. Richard Thompson entered, snow-dusting his expensive coat. His eyes narrowed at the sight of Peter. I thought we had an understanding about the boy, he said to Father Matthew, ignoring Helen completely. The understanding has changed, Father Matthew replied, standing. Like when you understood the shelter's account would be frozen unless Helen cooperated. Thompson's facade cracked slightly. Careful, Father, churches can burn. Like St. Mary's, Helen's voice cut through the room like ice. My husband took photographs of your men there too, Richard, right before the electrical fire that destroyed it. You're lying, Thompson snarled, but his hand twitched toward his phone. The state prosecutor has copies of everything, Helen continued. If anything happens to us, to this church, or to any of our people, it all comes out. Thompson's face went through a series of calculations. Davidson won't be happy. Davidson can join you in prison, Peter spoke up, his voice stronger than any of them had ever heard it. Or you can do the right thing, help us stop this. Help you, Thompson laughed bitterly. You don't understand what you're dealing with. This goes beyond Davidson, beyond Millbrook. The development plans involve state officials, federal contracts. All the more reason to expose it, Father Matthew said. Richard, you used to serve as an altar boy here yourself. Your mother still comes to daily mass. Is this really what you want your legacy to be? Thompson moved to the window, staring out at the snow-covered cemetery where generations of Millbrook residents lay buried, including Thomas Crawford. They'll kill me if I talk, he whispered. Then we'll protect you, Father Matthew promised. The church has ways of hiding people who need sanctuary. Helen and Peter can testify to that. A long moment passed. Finally, Thompson turned back, his face aged by decision. Davidson's meeting the investors tonight. 8 o'clock at the old factory. They're signing the final contracts. He pulled out his phone, fingers flying over the keys. I'm sending you access codes, security schedules, everything I have. Thank you, Helen said softly. Thompson couldn't meet her eyes. Don't thank me. This doesn't make up for Thomas. For what we did to your family. No, Helen agreed. But it's a start. As Thompson left, Father Matthew noticed the wax figure on his desk seemed to glow faintly in the winter light. The symbol carved on its chest no longer looked menacing, but almost protective. We have 6 hours, he said, gathering the evidence. Helen, contact the prosecutor. Peter, we need to get the shelter residents somewhere safe. They'll be the first targets if this goes wrong. What about you, Father Peter asked. Father Matthew picked up the wax figure, its warmth spreading through his fingers. I'm going to pray. And then I'm going to make sure Davidson and his people never threaten this church or its people again. None of them noticed Margaret Wheeler slipping away from her listening post outside the study door, her own phone already pressed to her ear as she hurried through the gathering storm. The clock in St. Francis's Tower began to toll, each ring echoing like a warning through the empty streets of Millbrook. The final battle for the church's soul, and perhaps the town's, was about to begin. By late afternoon, Millbrook had become a town divided. Word of Helen's confession and Thompson's revelation spread rapidly, creating fault lines through families and friendships that had endured for generations. Inside St. Francis, Father Matthew knelt before the altar, his collar feeling like a noose. The church was eerily quiet, with only the occasional crack of freezing wood breaking the silence. The pews, normally filled for evening mass, stood empty as congregations split between those protesting outside the mayor's office and those gathering at Margaret Wheeler's emergency community meeting. Father Peter's voice echoed from the entrance. They're starting to gather at the factory. Earlier than Thompson said. Father Matthew remained kneeling, his eyes fixed on the crucifix. How many? Dozens, not just Davidson's people. Half the parish council is there. And Peter hesitated. They're calling for a vote to deconsecrate the church. Margaret's leading it. The words hit Father Matthew like physical blows. Deconsecration would strip St. Francis of its historical protection, leaving it vulnerable to demolition. More than that, it would invalidate every baptism, every marriage, every funeral he performed. What have I done, Peter, he whispered. By taking sides, I've torn the parish apart. You took the side of truth. Helen's voice joined them, her footsteps steady despite her exhaustion. The prosecutor's office received everything. They're mobilizing, but they won't make it before the meeting. Father Matthew finally stood, his joints cracking from the cold. The heating had been cut off, another technical difficulty courtesy of Davidson's influence. We're supposed to be a sanctuary, he said. Now we're ground zero for a war. Sometimes sanctuary requires fighting for what's right, Helen replied, but her voice caught as she watched several longtime parishioners walk past the church toward the factory, deliberately avoiding looking in. The wax figure sat on the altar where Father Matthew had placed it during his prayers. Its glass eyes seemed to reflect the fading daylight with an inner fire. I keep thinking about Father Daniel, Matthew said, touching his collar. What would he have done? He took me in without question, gave me a home, a purpose. But now he gestured to the empty church. I've driven away the very people he spent decades bringing together. Father Daniel believed in justice. Helen reminded him. Remember his last sermon? Faith without action is dead. But at what cost? Father Matthew turned to them, his face haunted. We'll save the building, maybe expose corruption, but what about the souls? Margaret Wheeler's grandparents helped build this church. The Thompsons have attended for 4 generations. These aren't just names on a parish register, they're family. Peter approached the altar, standing beside the wax figure. When I was on the streets, he said quietly, before St. Francis, I learned something about family. Sometimes the ones who claim the strongest ties are the first to turn away when facing hard truths. A commotion outside drew their attention. Through the frosted windows, they could see a growing crowd at the factory, car headlights cutting through the early winter darkness. Among them, Margaret Wheeler's voice carried clearly, the church has been corrupted. Father Matthew harbors criminals, spreads lies about respected citizens. Lies. Helen's bitter laugh echoed off the vaulted ceiling. My husband's body is buried in their precious cemetery, murdered for telling the truth." Father Matthew touched the wax figure, feeling its familiar warmth. "Peter, you said you had dreams about this figure. What did you see?" Peter hesitated. "Not dreams exactly, more like memories. When I touch it, I see a woman placing it in the offering box. She's crying, but not from sadness. It's like she's finally putting down a heavy burden." Helen's eyes widened. "The night I put it there, I prayed for strength. To finally tell the truth, to reclaim my son, to stop running from what happened to Thomas. And since then," Father Matthew mused, "everything hidden has been coming to light. The corruption, Peter's identity, Thompson's conscience." A loud bang made them jump, the church doors flying open as Thompson himself burst in, his face pale. "They're coming," he gasped. "Davidson found out I talked. They're not waiting for the meeting. They're coming to burn it all down now." Father Matthew straightened, something shifting in his expression. The crisis of faith that had plagued him all day seemed to crystallize into clarity. "Good," he said, "surprising them all. Let him come." Father Peter stepped closer, concerned. "I've been asking what Father Daniel would do," Matthew continued, his voice growing stronger. "But I forgot his most important lesson. God doesn't call us to be comfortable. He calls us to be faithful." He picked up the wax figure, its warmth now spreading up his arm like a current of strength. "Helen, get the shelter residents to the basement tunnel, the one that connects to the old brewery. Peter, Thompson, help me barricade the doors. If they want to destroy this sanctuary, they'll have to face the very people they've tried to make invisible." As they moved to their tasks, Father Matthew looked up at the towering figure of Christ on the cross. "Forgive me for doubting," he whispered. "Sometimes the hardest act of faith is standing firm when everything seems lost." Outside, engines roared as vehicles approached through the storm. The electric lights flickered and died, leaving only candles to illuminate the ancient stones of St. Francis. But in that darkness, the wax figure's eyes seemed to glow with an inner light, as if all the prayers ever whispered within these walls had finally found their moment of answer. The battle for St. Francis's soul was about to begin, and Father Matthew knew that after tonight, nothing would ever be the same. The first attack came at 7:45 p.m. when the temperature hit 20 below zero. A brick crashed through the rose window above the altar, sending centuries-old stained glass shattering across the sanctuary like fallen stars. There at the back door, Peter's voice echoed from the sacristy. The sound of splintering wood followed his warning. Father Matthew stood at the altar, the wax figure clutched in one hand, his father's rosary in the other. Through the broken window, he could see Davidson himself directing the assault, his expensive coat stark against the swirling snow. Margaret Wheeler stood beside him, holding what looked like building permits. "Helen," Matthew called out, "are the shelter residents secure?" "All 37 in the tunnel," Helen replied, emerging from the basement stairs. "But Father, the foundation's shifting. All this activity, the extreme cold." A terrible groaning sound cut her off. Ancient beams, stressed by decades of harsh winters, began to crack overhead. "The structural supports," Thompson said, his face ashen. "We knew they were weak. That's why Davidson was so confident about the demolition permit. One good shock and..." Another brick sailed through a window. The impact sent vibrations through the entire building. Dust and small debris began to rain down from the ceiling. "Everyone out," Father Matthew commanded. "To the basement tunnel now." "We're not leaving you," Peter insisted, moving to stand beside him. "This is my church, my responsibility." "No," Helen interrupted firmly. "This is our sanctuary. All of ours." The main doors burst open, bringing with them a blast of Arctic air and a dozen of Davidson's men. Among them were faces Father Matthew recognized: parish council members, local business owners, people he baptized and blessed. "It's over," Father Davidson called out, his voice carrying over the howling wind. "The vote passed. This building is condemned. Step aside and let progress happen." Progress, Matthew's voice rang with authority he didn't know he possessed. "Is that what you call corruption? Threatening the vulnerable? Destroying a house of God?" "Please," Margaret stepped forward, her resolve wavering at the sight of the damage. "No one needs to get hurt. The church's time has passed." Above them, another support beam cracked. The sound echoed like a gunshot. "Last chance," Davidson warned. "Clear the building, or—" He never finished. With a sound like thunder, the ceiling began to cave in. People screamed, scrambling for the doors. Through the chaos, Father Matthew saw a support column falling directly toward Peter. "No," Helen cried, launching herself forward. She slammed into Peter, pushing him clear as the column crashed down. The impact sent shockwaves through the floor, triggering a cascade of structural failures. "Mom!" Peter's scream cut through the din as Helen disappeared under the falling debris. Father Matthew grabbed Peter before he could run into the collapsing section. "The crypt," he shouted, dragging the struggling boy toward the basement stairs. "It's reinforced." Thompson was already there, holding the heavy door open. "Hurry." They half ran, half fell down the stairs as St. Francis began to tear itself apart above them. The wax figure in Matthew's hand grew so hot it almost burned, its glass eyes gleaming like beacons in the darkness. They reached the crypt just as the main collapse began. Through the thunderous roar, they could hear people screaming outside, car alarms wailing, and beneath it all, a sound like weeping from the stones themselves. Peter collapsed against a wall, sobbing, "She was my mother. All this time she was my mother, and I never got to." "She knew," Matthew said softly, holding the boy close. "Every time she looked at you, she knew." The chaos above gradually subsided, leaving only the sound of settling debris and the winter wind howling through new gaps in the church's shell. Thompson's phone cast weak light in the darkness of the crypt. "The prosecutor's team is 10 minutes out," he reported. "Emergency services, too. But in this storm—" Helen could still be Peter couldn't finish the sentence. Father Matthew looked at the wax figure, still radiating unnatural warmth. Its expression seemed different now, less a grimace of pain, more a look of determination. "Peter," he said slowly, "you said you saw her placing this figure. What else did you see in those visions?" "Light," Peter whispered. "Even in darkness there was always light." As if in response, the figure's glass eyes began to glow, illuminating a section of wall they'd never noticed before. Behind a loose stone, barely visible, was the entrance to another tunnel. The original catacombs, Thompson breathed. They predate the church itself. "This way," Matthew said, reading the signs he'd been too blind to see before. "She's showing us the way." Above them, St. Francis Church, sanctuary to the lost for over 2 centuries, lay in ruins. But in the darkness beneath, a mother's love was about to prove stronger than any foundation of stone. Through the ancient catacombs, they followed the wax figure's glow. The tunnels were narrow, the air thick with centuries of silence. Every few feet, Father Matthew would pause, holding the figure higher as its light revealed religious symbols carved into the walls, signs left by those who had sought sanctuary here generations ago. "These tunnels," Thompson whispered, "they were part of the Underground Railroad. Helen knew about them. She was researching the church's history, trying to prove its historical significance." Peter moved like a man possessed, his fingers trailing along the wall markings. "She used to tell me stories about secret passages, about people finding safety in the darkest places. I thought they were just stories to help me sleep." A distant sound stopped them, something between a groan and a prayer. "Helen!" Father Matthew called out, his voice echoing strangely. Matthew, the response was weak, but unmistakably Helen's voice. "Peter." They found her in a chamber where several tunnels converged. She lay trapped beneath a fallen beam, blood staining her gray hair crimson. But her eyes, when they found Peter's, shone with a fierce love that defied the darkness. "My boy," she whispered. "My beautiful boy." Peter fell to his knees beside her. "Why didn't you tell me? All this time?" "I was protecting you." Helen's breath came in ragged gasps. "Like Thomas protected the truth. Some things are worth dying for." "No one else is dying tonight," Father Matthew declared, examining the beam. "Thompson, help me lift this." But Helen's hand shot out, gripping Matthew's wrist with surprising strength. "Listen," she commanded. "Davidson, the mayor, they're planning something bigger. The development. It's not just about the church, the whole historic district. They're using federal funds, illegally." "Save your strength," Peter pleaded. No time. Helen's eyes were growing distant. In my office. False bottom in the right drawer. Everything you need to stop them. Promise me you'll finish this." "We'll finish it together," Peter insisted, tears falling freely now. The wax figure in Father Matthew's hand suddenly blazed with light, illuminating the chamber fully. In that moment they could see that the beam hadn't just trapped Helen, it had prevented the entire tunnel section from collapsing. Helen smiled, as if understanding something they couldn't yet see. "My sweet boy," she said to Peter, "I gave you up once. To protect you. I won't fail you again." Before anyone could move, Helen pulled a small lever hidden in the floor beside her. The sound of ancient machinery groaning filled the tunnel. "Helen," no Father Matthew lunged forward, but it was too late. "Get him out," Helen commanded, her voice stronger now. "The tunnel will collapse when the beam shifts. This section was designed to be sealed, to protect those inside from those pursuing them." "Mom, please," Peter begged, "we can find another way." "I already did." Helen's smile was radiant despite her pain. "I found you again. I protected our sanctuary. I told the truth. Thomas would be proud." She looked at Father Matthew. "Take care of our boy." The machinery's groan grew louder. Small stones began falling from the ceiling. "Now," Helen shouted, "go." Father Matthew grabbed Peter, physically dragging him back as Thompson helped pull them into the adjacent tunnel. The last thing they saw was Helen Crawford, treasurer of St. Francis Church, mother and protector, closing her eyes in peace as the passage sealed itself forever. Peter's scream of anguish echoed through the catacombs, a sound of loss so profound it seemed to shake the very foundations of faith. Father Matthew held him as he collapsed, their tears mingling in the dust of centuries. The wax figure's light dimmed to a gentle glow, like a candle lit in memoriam. Its expression had changed again, now showing neither pain nor determination, but a serene acceptance that reminded Matthew of the saints in the church's fallen windows. "She knew," Thompson said softly. "She knew about the tunnel design. She studied everything about this place, preparing for this moment. She died protecting others," Matthew responded, still holding the shaking Peter. "Like Thomas. Like the people who built these tunnels. Like Christ." Peter finished, his voice hollow. She said some things are worth dying for." Above them they could hear sirens and voices. The prosecutor's team would be searching the ruins. Davidson and his conspirators would soon face justice. But here, in the darkness beneath St. Francis, a different kind of justice had already been served, one written not in law books, but in a mother's final sacrifice. Father Matthew helped Peter to his feet, the wax figure lighting their way forward. They would emerge into a changed world, where truth had been bought at a terrible price. But as they walked, he remembered Helen's words about sanctuary. Sometimes it wasn't just a place to hide, but a place to find the strength to face what must be faced. Wow, what a powerful moment in our story. If you've been moved by Helen's sacrifice and the power of faith, please consider subscribing to our channel. Every new subscriber helps us share more stories that touch hearts and illuminate the real meaning of faith and love. Let's keep this community growing together. The news of Helen Crawford's death spread through Millbrook like a shockwave as dawn broke over the ruins of St. Francis. The morning papers carried two headlines: historic church collapses and major corruption ring exposed. But on the streets, people spoke only of Helen. They found her office exactly as she'd left it, the false bottom drawer containing enough evidence to shake the foundations of local government. But it was the personal items that told the real story: photographs of Peter as a baby, birthday cards never sent, newspaper clippings of his school achievements she'd secretly collected over the years. Outside the police tape surrounding the church ruins, a makeshift memorial grew. Even those who had stood with Davidson found themselves drawn there, leaving flowers and handwritten notes. "Forgive us, Helen. We didn't understand. You protected us all. A mother's love never dies." Margaret Wheeler arrived at sunrise, her face aged by guilt, placing a single white rose among the tributes. "I've withdrawn the deconsecration request," she told Father Matthew, who stood vigil nearby. "And I've given the prosecutor everything I know about Davidson's plans." The shelter residents, safely evacuated through Helen's tunnel system, returned to place candles at the memorial. Many shared stories of her quiet kindness, extra blankets appearing on cold nights, medical bills mysteriously paid, warm meals provided without question. Peter sat among the ruins, clutching his mother's prayer book found in the debris. Inside, she'd written daily prayers for him, spanning the 16 years they were apart. Lord, keep him safe tonight. Let him know he's loved, even if not by me. Guide him home when the time is right. The last entry, dated the morning of her death, reads simply, "Thank you for bringing him back to me. Now give me strength to protect him one last time." Father Matthew watched his congregation gather around Peter, not with the previous day's suspicion, but with understanding and shared grief. The elderly women who had once whispered about his past now brought him food and embraced him as their own. Thompson, released after cooperating with authorities, stood at the edge of the crowd. The prosecutor says her testimony, recorded the night before, it's enough to bring down not just Davidson but half the state government. She knew she might not survive to testify in person. She planned everything. Not everything, Father Matthew replied softly, touching the wax figure that hadn't left his possession since that night. She planned to protect what mattered: her son, her truth, her sanctuary. The cost. His voice caught. The cost was higher than any of us could have imagined. As evening fell, the first snow since the collapse began to fall. The flakes seemed to glow as they passed through the candlelight of the memorial, creating halos in the gathering darkness. Someone began to sing Amazing Grace, the hymn Helen had always requested during services. In that moment, as voices joined together in the winter twilight, St. Francis Church felt more alive in its ruins than it ever had standing whole. Helen Crawford had given more than her life; she had given her community back its soul. In the days following Helen's death, her true legacy emerged through a meticulous trail of evidence she'd compiled over 2 decades. Father Matthew and Peter spent hours in her small apartment, uncovering layers of a crusade that had begun long before Thomas Crawford's murder. Hidden in a wall safe, they found Helen's personal journal. The entries painted a portrait of a woman who had transformed grief into purpose. March 15, 1998, Thomas showed me the documents today. Construction contracts, falsified inspections, money laundering through church donations. He says we have to expose them. I'm terrified, but he's right. Some evils must be fought, not fled. April 3, 1998, they made it look like suicide. But I know. Thomas never gambled a day in his life. Our baby boy will never know his father. God forgive me, but I have to give him up. They're watching me, but I won't let them win. Not in the end. Peter's hands trembled as he read entries tracking his life from afar. September 12, 2008 saw Peter at the school play today. Had to sit in the back. He has Thomas's smile. The same light in his eyes. The same sense of justice. I pray he never faces the choices we did. Thompson arrived with more revelations. She infiltrated their organization, he explained, spreading documents across Father Matthew's kitchen table. Took a job as church treasurer because she knew they were using religious organizations to launder money. Spent years tracking every transaction, every shell company. All while watching her son grow up from a distance, Father Matthew murmured. The most damning evidence lay in recordings. Helen had made conversations with corrupt officials, secret meetings, threats against those who opposed Davidson's plans. Her final recording, made the night before her death, was addressed to Peter. My dearest boy, if you're hearing this, I've finally done what your father died trying to do. The truth is out. But truth alone isn't enough. It needs people brave enough to stand for it. Your father had that courage. I see it in you too. Forgive me for the years of silence. Every day apart was a sacrifice made so you could have this moment, the chance to live in a world where good people don't have to hide from evil ones. The recording ended with a prayer, not for justice or vengeance, but for healing. For the community she'd served, for the son she'd protected, for the church that had given them both sanctuary. As the scope of Helen's battle became clear, local papers began calling her the guardian of St. Francis, but in the shelter now temporarily housed in the community center, they simply called her Mother Helen. The woman who had sacrificed everything to protect not just her own child, but all of God's children who sought sanctuary in her church. Her final victory was still unfolding, each revelation another stone in the foundation of truth she'd died building. But the price of that victory, measured in years of silent sacrifice and a mother's unfulfilled love, would haunt Millbrook for generations to come. The revelation of Helen's letter to Peter came on a bitter Sunday morning 1 week after her death. Hidden behind a loose brick in her office wall, the envelope bore a simple inscription for Peter, "When the truth comes out." Inside, Peter found 2 decades of suppressed maternal love poured onto pages stained with tears. Helen detailed how she had discovered her pregnancy shortly after Thomas's murder, how Davidson's men had made it clear her child would suffer the same fate if she didn't stay silent. She described the agony of giving up her baby, watching him grow from afar, and the divine intervention she perceived when he appeared at St. Francis years later. The letter revealed her quiet acts of protection, how she'd engineered his position as altar boy, ensured he always had warm clothes, and left food in the kitchen when she knew he was hungry. Most heartbreaking were her descriptions of every Christmas, every birthday spent watching him from a distance, fighting the urge to embrace him and whisper the truth. "I died 1,000 deaths staying silent," she wrote, "but I would die 1,000 more to keep you safe." The letter concluded with a revelation that shook the community. Several prominent officials, including Mayor Davidson, had been involved not just in Thomas's death, but in a decades-long scheme targeting vulnerable families, using their children as leverage to maintain control. Helen had spent years gathering evidence, building a case that would expose not just corruption, but a systemic abuse of power that had destroyed countless lives. Her final words to Peter carried both absolution and hope. "My precious son, don't let grief poison your heart like their evil poisoned our years together. Your father died fighting for justice. I lived for it. Now it's your turn to live for love. That's the true victory they can never take from us." The impact of these revelations rippled through Millbrook like a spiritual earthquake. The same community that had once whispered accusations against Peter now saw him as a living testament to the power of sacrificial love. Father Matthew watched as his parishioners, one by one, came forward with their own stories of Helen's secret kindnesses, building a mosaic of grace that had been hidden beneath the surface of their shared lives. The exposure of corrupt officials unfolded like a carefully orchestrated symphony. Each note played exactly as Helen had planned. Her evidence, meticulously gathered over 20 years, proved devastating. Mayor Davidson and his conspirators were arrested in a pre-dawn raid that shook Millbrook to its core. The investigation revealed a web of corruption far more extensive than anyone had imagined. Helen's recordings implicated state senators, federal judges, and religious leaders who had used their positions to profit from the suffering of the vulnerable. The prosecution's key evidence was a recording Helen had made the night before her death, detailing how Davidson's organization had systematically targeted historic churches across the state, using them to launder money while destroying community spiritual foundations. Most shocking was the revelation that St. Francis had been just one piece of a larger scheme. Dozens of churches had already fallen victim, their congregations scattered, their histories erased. Helen's final act of defiance had saved not just her church, but potentially hundreds of others. The depth of Davidson's perfidy stunned even his closest allies. Bank records showed millions in stolen funds, property deeds obtained through extortion, and a systematic campaign to silence whistleblowers like Thomas Crawford. Margaret Wheeler, now a key witness for the prosecution, revealed how Davidson had manipulated religious communities, playing on their fears of change to facilitate his schemes. Helen Crawford didn't just expose corruption, the state prosecutor announced at a press conference held in front of St. Francis's ruins. She documented the systematic destruction of America's spiritual heritage for profit, but perhaps the most profound revelation came from Thompson, who finally confessed his role in Thomas Crawford's death. His testimony, inspired by Helen's sacrifice, provided the final link needed to bring murder charges against Davidson and his inner circle. The truth had indeed come out, just as Helen had planned, not with the thunderous rage of vengeance, but with the quiet certainty of justice long deferred. The transformation of Millbrook began with the ruins of St. Francis. On a bright December morning, 6 months after Helen's sacrifice, Father Matthew stood before a gathered crowd, Peter at his side, to announce the church's rebirth. The reconstruction would honor both past and future, incorporating the original stones while creating a modern sanctuary designed to serve the community's most vulnerable members. The Helen Crawford Memorial Shelter would form the heart of the new complex, its doors permanently open to those seeking refuge. Peter, now studying architecture at the local college, had helped design the new building, ensuring the underground tunnels were preserved as a testament to those who had sought sanctuary there. The project drew support from unexpected quarters. Former opponents of the church, touched by Helen's sacrifice, became its strongest advocates. Margaret Wheeler donated her family's considerable wealth to the rebuilding fund, transforming her guilt into grace. Even Thompson, following his testimony and reduced sentence, dedicated his legal expertise to creating a foundation that would protect historic churches nationwide. The wax figure, its mysterious purpose now fulfilled, found a permanent home in a glass case near the altar, its glass eyes watching over the congregation as they rebuilt not just their church, but their community's soul. On Christmas Eve, as candlelight filled the partially reconstructed sanctuary, Father Matthew observed faces illuminated by more than just flame, the light of understanding, of redemption, of faith tested and strengthened by trial. The homeless shelter residents sat alongside the town's wealthiest citizens, their voices joined in hymns that echoed off ancient stones and new beams. In that moment he understood that Helen's true legacy wasn't just the exposure of corruption or the salvation of the church, it was the revelation that sanctuary isn't found in buildings but in the hearts of those brave enough to protect it. The story of St. Francis Church and Helen Crawford's sacrifice spread far beyond Millbrook's borders, touching hearts and inspiring change across the nation. On the first anniversary of her death, as snow fell softly on the rebuilt church's new spire, Peter stood before a congregation that had swelled to include visitors from across the country. He shared not just his mother's story, but the deeper truth she had died protecting, that faith, love, and justice are inseparable gifts that must sometimes be purchased at great cost. The Helen Crawford Act, passed with bipartisan support, now protected historic religious buildings from predatory development, ensuring that no other community would suffer as Millbrook had. The underground tunnels became a living museum, their walls preserving the testimonies of those who had sought sanctuary there, from the Underground Railroad to Helen's final act of maternal love. Father Matthew, his hair now more gray than black, found his ministry transformed by the events he had witnessed. His sermon spoke not just of ancient miracles, but of modern acts of grace, of a mother's love stronger than corruption, of truth's power to heal even the deepest wounds, of redemption found in the darkest places. The wax figure, its purpose still debated by theologians and skeptics alike, remained a source of quiet strength for those who came seeking answers. Some claimed to see their own struggles reflected in its glass eyes, while others felt Helen's protective presence in its mysterious warmth. Yet perhaps the most profound legacy was visible in the daily life of the renewed St. Francis Church. The divisions that had once threatened to destroy it between rich and poor, faithful and doubting, past and future, had been transformed into bridges of understanding. Where accusation had once ruled, compassion now flourished. The sanctuary Helen died protecting had become more than a refuge. It was a living testament to the truth she had given her life to defend, that love, in its purest form, is the greatest power for change in a broken world. Dear friends, thank you for joining us on this emotional journey of faith, sacrifice, and redemption. If Helen's story has touched your heart, please consider subscribing to our channel. Every subscription helps us continue sharing these powerful stories of hope and courage. Hit that like button if you believe in the power of a mother's love, and share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that faith can move mountains. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What touched you most about Helen's sacrifice? And should we continue this story? Let us know if you'd like to see part 2, where we explore the aftermath of St. Francis's rebirth and the lasting impact of Helen's legacy.